Good evening. We are thankful for the presence of each and every one who's here with us this evening. I hope you have had a good Lord's Day thus far. Our lesson tonight comes from 1 Samuel chapter 25. It always works better when you turn it on. 1 Samuel chapter 25, looking at the lessons we can learn from Abigail. Abigail's story, in many ways, we can learn so many lessons, but I always read it and I kind of smile a little bit at the descriptions of her husband as you look at 1 Samuel chapter 25. And Abigail is a prime example why husbands need their wives to be a good helper in this life. We find, you look at 1 Samuel chapter 25, as I'll look through in a moment, it'll describe both Abigail and her husband. But I want you to think for just a moment. Now, there have been times in your life that you can stop and say, I'm glad my wife gave me advice on this moment. My wife advised me differently on this or asked me to reconsider something. I remember when we first got to Oak Grove, we had a lot of we had, as we got to the fall, we have trees in our yard now. When the house we came from in Oklahoma had no trees at all. And so when we moved to our home here, we have a big tree in the front, there's several in the back, which when it came to fall meant all the leaves went to the ground, obviously. And so I decided, well, I'm going to burn these leaves. I don't want to mess with mulching them, so I'm just going to burn them. And I remember I was in the backyard and I had the leaves in the fire pit, and there were so many of them. I was going to have to be there all day probably doing it. But I was going to burn them because I didn't want to mess with mulching it. And I'm sitting there watching it, and it's not really burning. I put some fluid on it and let it flame up and went back down, just smoking and smoking. Then I hear a voice behind me, and I hear, "Hey nerd, you're smoking up the entire neighborhood." Now what was she meaning by that? There's got to be a better way of doing this, right? Now, I laughed then. I still laugh about it now. And this morning I was thinking about talking about this. I thought, do I really want to bring it up? I thought, well, why not? But because she was in the right. I was the one who looked foolish, right? The whole neighborhood was indeed in smoke. And as I stepped back and I was looking, the wind, if the wind in Missouri moves at all, it's going to fill up the whole entire neighborhood, and it did. Well, we find with the story of Abigail, the way she helps her husband was much more than just something as trivial as burning leaves. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, I want us to notice, if you will, with me, 1 Samuel chapter 25, and let's look at verses 2 and 3, and notice how these two individuals are described. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, and let's look there beginning in verse 2. And here the Bible says, "And there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel, and the man was very great, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. She was a woman of good understanding and of beautiful countenance. But a man was churlish and evil in his doings, he was of the house of Caleb." Now, in case you don't know what churlish means, the idea was that he was hard, he was cruel, he was severe, he was difficult. And I think when you think about Nabal, or Nabal, however you pronounce his name, he's evil, so you can mispronounce his name, I don't care. But with Abigail and her husband, what we find here is that he was one, I think that Abigail would say, was indeed difficult to deal with. We think about this idea. Let's look at the background story of Abigail here. And of course, we have to talk about what is happening with Nabal as well. The events recorded here are from the time period when David was fleeing from the wrath of Saul. Rather than fight Saul, David and his 600 men fled into the wilderness. In this same region, a wealthy man named Nabal kept his herds. David and his men treated Nabal's herdsmen well and even protected them and their flocks both day and night. So this gives you the background of where we are, right? David is running from Saul because Saul is wanting to kill him because he's a little psycho at the moment. But what we find here is that when we get to this point, Abigail and Nabal are there, and Nabal is working with David and his servants directly, right? Now, if you go and look at 1 Samuel chapter 25 and look at verse 25, we look at this idea of how there is a story and a name. In 1 Samuel 25, verse 25, and we're going to come back to talk more about this later, but notice what Abigail says about her husband here when she speaks to David. Let not my lord, I pray thee, regard this man Beel, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. If you look at the name Nabal, what it means is full. And she says here in verse 25 that he is living up to his name. She's his wife, and she is saying, look, he is being foolish. He is being ignorant. This doesn't mean that she doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't mean that she doesn't love this man, because she wouldn't do the things that she's going to do if she didn't care something about him. But he was indeed acting like a fool. On a feast day, David sent 10 of his men to request provisions. Nabal, however, would refuse, but it was a reasonable payment for the services that David had provided without being asked. Not every farmer has 600 men guarding his flock, right? Guarding all his cattle and livestock. But of course, Nabal, here he refused to recognize David. And it seems he knew something about David's background because he alludes to him being on the run. Keep in mind, why was David on the run in the first place? Because Saul was pursuing him, right? But why was Saul pursuing him? Because he was jealous. Do you remember, think back to the time period when Saul hears the people singing songs about him and then singing songs about David? Do you remember how it went? Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Keep in mind, that is who Nabal is messing with. Why would you mess with someone? Why would you refuse to give him this payment to a man who has literally killed so many people in battle? And yet that's what Nabal is doing, right? And he is, no doubt, as his wife would say, he is acting very foolishly. However, we look here in 1 Samuel 25 that really Nabal kind of refers to David like a runaway servant who is hiding from his legitimate master. And as we look in verse chapter 25, I'm not going to read every verse, obviously, but Nabal's attitude was, why should I take food from my servants and give to vagabonds? Vagabonds? That's how he refers to the servants and workers of David. You ever think about how sometimes in life, sometimes we hear the phrase, don't poke the bear? David had servants. He was a well-trained man in war. No doubt his servants were as well. Nabal is messing with the wrong person, isn't he? Of all the people you could try to refrain from giving payment, why would he pick David? Well, because he thought, well, he's just on the run. But he forgets who David is in the first place. David, of course, would become very angry at Nabal's rude response, and he called his men to war, having the intention to kill all the males in Nabal's household. Meanwhile, one of the servants, realizing what Nabal had done, ran to Abigail, right? Look with me in 1 Samuel chapter 25, looking there in verse 14. 1 Samuel chapter 25, looking at verse 14. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he railed on them. But the men were very good unto us, and we were not hurt. Neither missed we anything as long as we were conversant with them than we were in the fields, when we were in the fields. They were a wall unto us both by night and day, all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore, know and consider what thou wilt do, for evil is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a son of Beel that a man cannot speak to him. What did the servant tell Abigail? Your husband is going to get us all killed. That's what she's telling him. That's what he's telling her, rather. he's going to get everybody killed. You notice you back up there, he says how David's servants have treated them well. He says they were like a wall between us and anyone else all day and all night. He said they missed nothing. They did not miss anything, he says there in verse 15. They were a wall around them while they were keeping the sheep, verse 16. And how does he reply? Well, he says in verse 17, in such a way that your husband, nobody can even speak to him. They can't even speak reason to him. You ever known someone who they get so upset and we say they just became unreasonable. We can't even talk to them anymore. And that's what happened with Abigail's husband, right? Abigail, though, as we move into the more focused point of our lesson here, would save her foolish husband. As we look in 1 Samuel 25, verse 3 again, he was what? He was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was the house of Caleb. He was one who was difficult there in verse 3. As we think about what happens in chapter 25, we find that Abigail does indeed save her husband, because her husband, as their servants had said, you can't even talk to him anymore. And as they would say back in verse 17, that he is what? The evil determined against our master and against all his household. He's going to get himself killed, and all of us are going to get killed with him. But his wife acted quickly, didn't she? Look at verses 18 and 19. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 sheep ready dressed and 5 measures of parched corn and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on asses. And she said unto her servants, go on before me, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal. Why? Because, well, first of all, you couldn't even talk to him in the first place, right? What is she trying to do? She's trying to relieve the tension, isn't she? Keep in mind, as we find here in verse 18, Abigail says a good way to do that is you start with food, isn't it? But in all seriousness, she is going to try to keep him from getting killed and everybody else. She loaded up generous provisions for David's men and sent a servant ahead to tell David that she was coming. Then she rode out to meet David. She did not worry about the problems. She did not wait for David to come to her. She met her problems, you might say, face on, right? She went out to him. Why? Because she's concerned not only about David, as we're going to see, but also about her husband, about her servants, and about her whole household that was mentioned back there in verse 17. As we look in verse 23, we find that she was humble before David. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 23. And when Abigail saw David, she hasted and lighted off the ass and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground. What is she doing? She's being respectful to David, something her husband was unwilling to do. Unwilling to do. You know, you think about it again, keep in mind, this isn't the idea that David was a tyrant and was demanding things. As we go back and look for a second, back there in verse 15 and following, the first thing that the servants say in verse 15, the men were very good unto us. Very good unto us. But what they say concerning their master, regarding Abigail's husband, you can't even speak to that guy. And so when she goes out to David, she is being humble when she, as we find there in verse 23, she falls down her face and bowed herself to the ground there in verse 23. Now, she could have been indignant. She could have been arrogant when confronting David. She could have acted the same way that her husband did. You know, sometimes when one acts foolishly, sometimes we're not careful. We think, well, I'm going to defend them, so I'm going to act just like they are. I'm going to just jump on that bandwagon. Abigail didn't. She didn't get behind him in his foolishness. Instead, she's trying to get him to be reasonable. Looking in at verse 23. She bowed herself before David, right? But also look next what happens in verse 24 and following. She took the blame for her husband and asked for forgiveness. She came to ask that David would forgive her husband because she knew her husband wasn't going to come to David. Look at verse 24 and following here. And he fell at his feet and said, Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be. And let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience, and hear the words of thine handmaid. The first thing she says is what? Let his sin, let his error, right? That's what he's done. He has acted in a sinful way. She says, let it be upon me, and forgive his transgression, his iniquity there in verse 24. Then she says in verse 24 to what? To listen to, she asked very respectfully for him to listen to her for a moment, right? And in verse 25, she says, let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Beel, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord, whom thou didst send. She says in verse 25, regarding her husband, don't pay attention to him, he's a foolish man. And she says in verse 25, I saw not the young men of my Lord, meaning she was not there when Nabal was speaking to his servants in such ways. Verse 26, she says, now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies and they that seek evil to my Lord be as Nabal. We find here, what is she doing? She's wanting him to not commit sin by killing Nabal. We find there in verse 27, and now this blessing which thou handmaid hath brought unto my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord, and evil hath not been found in thee all thy days. She's saying, take what I brought to you, you take it, your servants take it, but forgive the trespass. Let the trespass of my husband be on me, and forgive that trespass, right? As she says in verse 28, I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid. But she wasn't the one who did it. But she's saying, look, forgive what he has done, right? We understand what she's saying. Forgive Nabal. Don't pay attention to him. His name means full, and he is living up to it, right? She's not speaking out of turn. She's only speaking truth. Because as the servant who came to her already has said, look, your husband, you can't speak to him. If he didn't, something's not done, we're going to die, and so are all those of your household. And we find in verse 28, notice what else that she points out here. She says here in verse 28, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, as God will make you a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord. Means you fight for God. She's recognizing who David is. You fight on the Lord's side. You are on the Lord's side there in verse 28. And evil hath not been found in thee all thy days. I mean, you have not done anything evil in these things, in this interaction with Nabal. So don't do anything evil now, right? Abigail said she was there to warn David. Was David about to sin? Well, if he went out and killed Nabal, yeah. Because even though Nabal was in the wrong and speaking evil and being disrespectful towards him, was not deserving of death, but it may find him anyway. Nabal, you might say, definitely was not nice. He definitely was instead very rude and disrespectful towards David. Abigail, though, pointed out how the Lord had been with David and has blessed him and will continue to bless him, as we see there in verses 28 and 29, right? We just read verse 28, look at verse 29. Yet a man is risen to pursue thee and seek thy soul, but the soul of thy Lord shall be found in the bundle of the life of the Lord thy God. And the souls of thine enemies, them shall he sling out as out of the middle of a sling. The New King James words it this way here in verse 29. Yet a man is risen to pursue you and seek your life, and the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling. What she's saying is, the Lord is with you. You're going to be protected. She says in verse 29, but the life of my Lord should be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, meaning God's going to protect you. Saul hasn't caught up to David and managed to kill him yet, has he? No. I think that's in part what she's referencing. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out, meaning what? Those who try to kill you, God will deal with, there in verse 29, right? She is recognizing who David is and how God is with him and how her foolish husband has acted wickedly. And the last thing she wants is for someone like David to sin by killing her foolish, stupid husband. Because that's what he was doing. He's acting in a very foolish and, yes, stupid way. She did not want David to sin. As we look there in verse 30 and 31, and it shall come to pass when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he hath spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel, that this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offense of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hast shed blood causeless, or that my Lord hath avenged himself. But when the Lord shall have dealt with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid. She's saying, when you are appointed the place that God's going to place you, remember me. But don't let my husband be something that is going to go against you or go on your record, right? Look there again in verse 31. That this shall be no grief unto thee, and nor offense of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hast shed blood causeless, or that my Lord hath avenged himself. So don't let this go against your charge. You're going to be placed in a position of power and authority by God. Don't let something like Nabal acting foolishly mess that up. And then she asks in verse 31 for him to remember her, right? We think about Abigail, before we go any further, she is a woman of tremendous courage, isn't she? I mean, this guy wants to kill her husband, and she decides to go to meet him face to face. That's pretty brave. Nabal didn't do that. It's easy to be brave when you're miles away from those you're talking about, isn't it? Like I tell people today, sometimes it's real easy to be brave behind a keyboard, behind a screen, when that person you're talking to isn't on the other side of it. Well, Abigail was very brave. She went to David. She brought him things to try to show that she was wanting to fix this problem, to give him food, give his servants food, and try to remove this tension between them and to spare the life of her husband. She went and met him face to face, didn't she? She was a woman of tremendous courage and showed great bravery in doing so. Nabal, on the other hand, was one who is extremely ignorant. Abigail waited until Nabal sobered up the next day to tell him what had happened, because as the text says there, that he was actually, it seemed that he was very intoxicated. And if you look here, let me scroll down here. If you look at verse 36 of 1 Samuel 25. And Abigail came to Nabal. Behold, he had a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry with him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing less or more until the morning light. But it came to pass in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. You ever hear the phrase, I was scared to death? Well, if you keep reading, look at verse 38. And it came to pass after about 10 days after, the Lord smote Nabal that he died. Fear was the last thing that Nabal felt. The Bible tells us there in verse 37, he became as a stone. His heart was filled with fear because he had done wrong. Now the Bible tells us the Lord smote Nabal that he died. I think we also say that yes, the Lord did no doubt do so, as the text tells us, but I think it's also safe to say that fear had a play in his death, didn't it? Arrogance, pride, ignorance, all those things. The news shocked Nabal so badly that he became like a stone, and 10 days later he died. As the text tells us, the Lord smote him. Why? Because he was an evil man. Some have asked, well, why would the Lord smote Nabal? Go all the way back to about verse 3 of chapter 25. Halfway down, starts talking about Nabal. What does it say? But the man was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was the house of Caleb. Why did he smote Nabal? Not just because he disrespected David, because he was evil, as the text says. Now notice, in his doings. He was, as his servants pointed out in verse 17, one that, as they say there, that a man cannot speak to him. He was rebellious, he was hard-hearted, he was evil, he put his wife's life in danger. His wife does what is right, and Nabal stays back and gets drunk. His wife tells him what has happened. 10 days later, the Lord smote him, right? Some lessons for us today. Abigail wasn't foolish. It was her wicked husband whom she saved. And if we were honest, she saved David, didn't she? She saved David from killing her husband. It's interesting as you think about how that all played out and how she warns David not to bring your revenge upon him. Don't avenge yourself upon him. But who does the avenging in the latter part of chapter 25? It's God. You know, the book of Romans tells us the same thing. It tells us not to seek vengeance out upon another, but the Lord will repay, right? We find the same thing here in 1 Samuel chapter 25. Abigail kept a righteous man from making a grave mistake. From making a grave mistake. The Bible tells us later she actually later will become a wife of David. She was a woman who wanted to do what was right. Her husband was one who was very evil. We don't know, I don't know anyway, how that relationship came together, how someone like Abigail, who had great understanding, married someone like Nabal, who was so evil. The Bible, if you notice there in that occasion, doesn't mention anything good about him at all, does it? It just tells us he had possessions there in verse 2, and then in verse 3 it tells us how he was a person who was churlish or difficult and evil in his doings. And as you read through chapter 25, we find it's true. So much so, you know, it's pretty bad when your wife says he's living up to his name, he is foolish. That's pretty bad, isn't it? And we find that she was one who was wanting to do what is right. She was the one trying to lead things in the right direction while Nabal was doing quite the opposite. Let us use Abigail's example and not go along with poor attitudes and harshness. You know, attitudes can be very difficult to overcome. We can think too highly of ourselves, and perhaps that's part of what his problem was. But we cannot allow those things to become who we are, to define who we are. With Nabal, we find there that seems to be exactly what happened. When his servants say you can't speak to him, the idea seems to me pretty clear that his attitude was that I am above David. Why should I give him anything? While David is the one who's actually doing him a favor, isn't he? Arrogance and a poor attitude, something that Abigail did not possess while her husband was overflowing with it. Abigail knew her husband well and was wise enough and kind enough to look out for him regardless of his shortcomings. She did not want him to be killed by David. She did not want David to be the one who did so. You might say she looked out for two people, didn't she? She looked out for Nabal, for David, and you might even say also for her own household, right? Going back to verse 17. She knew the shortcomings of her husband, and that's putting it very gently, isn't it? You know, we think about today our spouses, for those of us who are married. We should be grateful when our spouses help us in this life. Hopefully we'll never be one who can be defined in the same characteristics and having the same qualities as Nabal. But instead that we can be one who leads our house well and treats our wives as the Bible describes throughout the New Testament, right? We also should be mindful that Abigail was one who was very brave in what she did. We find that women are treated in different ways throughout the Bible. But one thing that we can find very, very easily is that God loves and respects and honors women who do those things which are good and pleasing in His sight. And Abigail did those things, didn't she? And she did those things in a household that was no doubt be very, very difficult. Can you imagine living with such a guy that you say freely that he lives up to his name of being foolish? They had a household, which means that they must have had not just servants, but possibly children as well. But she's having to live with that man every day. She comes back from trying to make sure his life is spared, and what is he doing? He's getting drunk. To the point, as the Bible says, she had to wait till the next day to talk to him, right? And then became afraid. Let us be those who are grateful for our wives who help us through difficult times, who help us hopefully see reason, to be reasonable. One thing that stands out to me There's many things to do, but one thing that stands out to me is Abigail's story is that when she hears about Nabal, what he's doing, she doesn't even bother to go to talk to him. She goes to David first, doesn't she? It seems to me she knew her husband very well. When her servant said there's no talking to him, that she understood there was no talking to him. Let us learn from Abigail's example and choose to do that which is right and good and pleasing in the sight of God. So no matter who around us may be doing evil, may be acting in foolish ways, may be behaving in difficult manner, at least be those who pursue what is right and good in the sight of God. This evening we can help you anyway. You can come forward now. Let's get every stand and sing the song that's been selected.
There's a fountain free.